Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, we got a new Cheeto-in-Chief, same as the old Cheeto-in-Chief. It's looking rough out there, and I'm sure all kinds of people are thinking about the election as good Christians going to church and also as good leftists going to their organizing meetings. But now that both of us have left the U.S., I'm just wondering, what's your vibe over there on Turf Island?
Oh my God, it's unhinged over here. There's a few different threads I think are worth picking up on just for the Americans to maybe revel in the insanity of it all. So on the one hand, people are like, "Wow, I can't believe the Americans did it. They're so stupid for electing such an idiot right-wing president." And like, let's be real, like they're not wrong. But also, you know, from the same group of people, the same island of people who did vote in Boris Johnson not too long ago, it's like, come on, are you sure? So anyways, lots of sort of like holier than thou, we would never gasping, but in a British accent. That's for sure it. There's also been some really funny things going on so there's if you're unfamiliar with UK politics, which you know what, not only is that okay, you probably should be. There is like the Westminster Parliament, which is the parliament for the entire UK, where the like the national governing parties go and make decisions. This guy named Keir Starmer from the Labour Party is the prime minister. You probably heard about him. Whatever. But also each country within the UK has its own devolved government. You can think of it kind of like a state government because it is kind of that, though maybe not exactly apt of a comparison. But the leader of the Scottish National Party, who's like the leader, he's like the first minister of Scotland, like basically the governor of Scotland, if you will, in American terms. His name's John Sweeney, and he is a part of a party that's supposed to be sort of like center left and sort of progressive, even though they definitely aren't these days. He did give a big congratulations to Donald Trump and said, "Can't wait to work with you." And then everybody was like shitting on him the rest of the day. Like, "You idiot, why would you bother saying that? We hate this." So there are those kind of responses. And then one more is like immediately after this local sort of organization, I don't need to name and shame them because it's not really that shameful, but they did decide to have like an anti-Donald Trump rally in a few major cities in the UK, which I thought was very bizarre. He's not the president here, guys. It's okay. It's not your fault. So anyways, lots of interesting expressions of like outrage and shock and disbelief while also accepting sort of the status quo, which I think is sort of a pretty good summation of British people, maybe in general. Like, you know, just like, this is bad, of course, but will we do anything to stop it? No, not really. It's just here, and we'll accept it, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, Dean, what's it like in Canada, in the great communist white north?
Well, sadly, we're actually still the British white north, if you think about it, given that we are still part of the Commonwealth. And I got to tell you, on this side of the Atlantic, it seems like the descendants of the Brits... Whoa. Sorry, hang on. On this side of the Atlantic, it sounds like the descendants of the Brits are carrying out a common program of ignorance. There's a sort of general dismay here as well, and also a kind of superiority, although it feels almost bleaker in Canada because we currently have the Liberal government, which is becoming incredibly sour, and people are souring on it, and we will surely have an election sometime very soon, definitely next year, but probably sooner than later. And that election, for sure, is going to go to the right and to an incredibly weirdo right-wing guy named Pierre Poilievre. And, man, it is so frustrating to listen to Canadians be so surprised that the U.S. did this and also talk about how they can't believe it when they're about to do the exact same thing. It drives me insane. It drives me nuts.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's how it's going over here in Canada. Lots more that we could say about that. And we'll return to it in a moment. We'll talk about Donald Trump. I'm sorry to tell you, this is a trigger warning. Maybe this is a Donald Trump episode. We're going to talk about it, and that's too bad for everybody, including us. But Matt, I decided this morning, as I was thinking about this, that maybe I would just pose a couple of questions to you, just to kind of warm us up a little bit, grease the gears, oil the gears, whatever you do to a machine to make it work better. And I thought also it would just give us a chance to kind of check in with, the fact that the world is still turning and there are still really important kind of questions that at least keep me up at night. And we usually go to Reddit for our questions. But this time I've decided to be vulnerable and bring you 2 questions that I did think about as I was going to sleep this week, which also shows you how broken my own brain is. And I just thought you could help me with them this time around.
Okay. Yeah, let me put my Youth Pastor hat on.
Right.
Okay, it's on.
Great. It looks great, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first one is, you've heard of the TV show Avatar.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
And in that TV show, there are famously 4 elements. Now, those 4 elements are found elsewhere, but most importantly, I think for our kind of cultural reference points, they're in the TV show Avatar. There's water, there's wind, there's fire, there's air. That's the 4th one.
Sure.
Hard to remember 4 things at a time.
The 4 elements, also the for our medieval listeners tuning in from 1200, those are the 4 humors as well. So just in case, just want to translate that for those listeners from Gaul.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. And I did want to do that. So I was thinking, for whatever reason, that like liminal state where you're like not quite asleep, but you're almost there, kind of the Peter Pan hour.
Right.
I had a weird thought, which was, okay, there's 4 elements. There are also 4 gospels.
Okay.
And I wonder, Matt, if you could just kind of assign Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John one of those elements. I feel like that would really help me kind of maybe restart my Bible reading habit going into the end of this year.
Yeah, I really dropped the ball on mine, that's for sure. You might remember an earlier episode this year where we were like, we're going to read the Bible, and then things got too real and did not do it. A great question. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to start with the gospel that is not a synoptic gospel, but is still one of the 4, John. So John is definitely the airbender gospel. It's ethereal, it's otherworldly. It has a sort of like Gnostic vibe to it. And we all know that the airbenders also have that sort of weird, not quite cultural appropriation of Buddhist philosophy. So I think that there's sort of a matchup. Let's see. So that's good. Mark is the gospel that is really quick and short, and it's just like getting from point A to point B as fast as you possibly can. So that's the firebender gospel.
That's a hot gospel.
That's a hot gospel. Now the other 2 are really difficult. Luke is the one that is most worried about the poor and sort of material reality. So that's the earthbender gospel. And Matthew is the waterbender gospel, and there's a reason for it, but I can't tell you what it is exactly.
I'm pretty sure that's how they did it in the show, too.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's about right. Yeah, I don't know. Dean, did I pass the test? I feel like I've just answered the questions critical to a puzzle that's going to let me into even a deeper, darker dungeon or something.
That's right, and welcome to it. You have made it, and that is going to be a great segue into the second question I do have for you. But yeah, you did do it, and just for fun, before we started recording this, I decided to make my own list of them just to compare, kind of sight unseen. And we do have the same exact list, so that's great. It must be true.
Oh, wow.
2 out of 2 doctors on this podcast agree.
That's the spirit moving.
It's the spirit moving. As we descend deeper into this dungeon, which you have unfortunately unlocked for yourself, and that is your fault, I just want to remind you. Okay. I was thinking, so we went to Rome and we saw a lot of bones, we saw a lot of bodies, famously, and it just got me thinking, I feel like it has unlocked some incredibly weird part of my own psyche. I have decided to become so invested in understanding medieval theologies of pain and weird stuff that my wife told me this week that she was genuinely concerned about me. and anyway, it's just gotten me thinking about the weirdest parts of the Catholic Church and relics in particular. And Matt, as a person who's not Catholic, but was, as you admitted to me at one point walking around Rome, kind of strangely attracted to it for a brief moment, what would be the relic that would turn you off completely and be like, I'm out. This is too much.
Which one would turn me off completely? I think the lamer, like the worse off, the worse the relic, the more normal the relic is, the least interested I would be in it. So, like, skull is cool. I think Skull's great. Um, we saw a piece of like Thomas Aquinas's arm bone or something, and honestly, I looked at it and I didn't even really think about it very much because there was barely anything to see, just like a little bit of bone. So I think that's like the least good relic is like just a bit of your bone. I want like full recognizable body part, I think, is where I'm at with the relics. Dean, do you have an answer to this question that's more clever than mine?
No, but that is an interesting direction to go in. That the the more normie the relic is, the worse it is for you. I thought maybe you'd go in the opposite direction, which is great to hear. That welcome to the club. You are in fact Roman Catholic. That's the test that you have to pass.
Oh no!
What got me thinking about it is I was reading about a mystical vision by a woman in the 13th century, I think. And man, I can't remember who it is. She's very famous. Everybody who listens to this podcast who knows about mysticism is about to tell me that I got the date wrong or can't remember the name, whatever. But she had a wild vision where upon being married to Christ, instead of using a wedding ring, he used his foreskin to marry her. And that's her wedding ring in the vision. And I thought that takes a lot of just sort of openness.
Christ's foreskin? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the one they cut off that he carries around metaphysically all the time in his pocket.
Yeah, okay. I would. Yeah, okay. No, it's fine. I'm not going to say anything about that. That's totally cool.
Great.
I like that.
You've passed the test, and welcome to the club. I can't wait for you to get through RCIA or OCIA or whatever they're calling it now.
What if I did show up though to one of those great catechisms and was just like, when are we going to talk about body parts? Like, what if I came and I was the bone pervert and I was just only asking sort of those questions?
That's right.
Yeah, sure, transubstantiation, no big deal. But when are we going to talk about the bones? I just need to get into this.
That's right. If you're in your OCIA right now, sit at the back of the class in the next one and just sort of find a handful of relics and bizarre stories to kind of just punctuate the lecture with. They're trying to tell you about transubstantiation. They're trying to tell you about the sacrament of baptism or whatever. And you should just kind of raise your hand and ask a non sequitur, like, how come there are 4,000 bones in the bottom of this church in Rome right now?
I think that's a great idea. And like, okay, people have so many problems with believing in theology, but like, have you just considered the most problematic part, which is all of the bones that are down there? No, like, whatever, the Trinity, it's hard to get your mind around, I guess, whatever. But like, there's a lot of bones in that church that no one's talking about. That's and I feel like that's a problem.
All right. We're going to transition to talking about the worst part of this whole thing, Donald Trump, worse than any relic you could possibly imagine. And our
first non-Catholic but Catholic president,
well, Catholic vice president, sadly.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's true. But he's always playing Ave Maria. He's always playing, like different sort of weird Catholic hymns at his rallies. So that's something.
That's right.
A win for the Catholics, I suppose.
Something for us, that's for sure. Before we did that, I did want to do a quick sort of temperature check for two reasons. So people, longtime listeners to this podcast, might remember we started this podcast after Donald Trump got inaugurated in 2016. It's crazy to think we've been doing this podcast for 8 years. That is absurd. And back then, it was a different time and a different place, and even a different symbolic universe. If I remember rightly, at the time, Rod Dreher had written an incredibly unhinged blog post fantasizing about being trapped in the basement of Rachel Held Evans, R.I.P. And he was sort of, just having this weird fantasy about being stuck in the dungeon of these liberals. And it was all very funny, and that was kind of the universe out of which our podcast was born. But things have changed in the last 8 years, and lately, I mean, the metaphor that's doing it for me is thinking that it is, in fact, crab season. We suspended crab season when we traveled because it was important just to let ourselves have fun. But I want to check in with you, Matt. Is crab season back? And is crab season the kind of season we're probably going to be in for the next 4 years? Or is there any other kind of seasonal metaphor, any other sort of basement-themed space that we should be kind of thinking from as we do this podcast under a Donald Trump presidency?
Yeah, while I buy myself some time to think about this very pressing question, let me just point out that Rod Dreher went from a person who was like, afraid of woke Christians or whatever, and like, Christians just have to get out and have an intentional community sort of in a trad way. He went from that guy to being like a Viktor Orban guy, which I think is so wild. He went from like, weird trad person to extremely fascist, and maybe he was the entire time, but a crazy thing. Rod's arc of his life, it does not bend towards justice. It just bends towards being a complete weirdo. Okay, I think that crab season's here to stay. I'm never gonna not be crabby. It's like, put me in the pot, boil me alive, please. I feel like that's kind of where we're at. It feels, temperature-wise, it feels like the pot's boiling over. Things are really bad. I think one of the like hardest things about this all is just like like how we don't really know what will happen. I mean, this is always the case with presidential politics and new elections and sort of like weird stuff like that. Like, you never know exactly like what was just a weird talking point on the campaign trail and what is like a real thing that is going to happen now. It's so complicated. It seemed like Elon Musk was a weird novelty of the campaign trail, that he was part of the Trump sort of thing. And isn't that funny and embarrassing? And and now it's like, well, he's going to be making a lot of decisions about the climate in the United States, which is terrifying and scary and bad. So, I'd say crab season is just here. A sort of like, I'm a crab in the pot being boiled, and every now and again someone comes to lift the lid on it and check on me. It's rough. I don't know. What do you think, Dean? Are there any other, apt metaphors?
Nope, no, I think that's right to me. I've pivoted to already using sort of Zoidberg-themed gifts, finding crab kaiju images and so on, just to kind of fill my camera roll on my phone for when I need to send a text to somebody, replying to a headline or something. And it is definitely crab season. And, the challenge of crab season is to survive the pot. I think that's the sort of theme of this podcast. Survive the pot, resist the chef, don't get cooked. That's we're gonna find the right kind of t-shirt slogan for this, but that's it. It's crab season. I'm glad that you agree, and we're here we are.
I like this. This is a good visual metaphor, because it's like, okay, the crab, first of all, they the brand of the crab is being a cantankerous animal. You're always mad, you're always upset, somebody's always trying to eat you. And most times you do get eaten, I would say. But also the imagery of a crab is like, they can always pinch it when you're not looking. There's always a feeling of resistance with the crab.
That's right. Release the claw. Take the rubber bands off in the next 4 years. The crab is really unlocking a lot for me right now. I think the crab is the symbol. That's right. That's it.
I'm sending an email to all of my liberal friends, and I'm telling them that the crab is the new sort of liberal resistance imagery. So everyone's going to be posting the crab emoji, hashtag release the craw. Oh my God. Hashtag release the claw. We're getting into it this year. It's going to be a good one.
Okay, hang on. While we're doing this really quick, I am just looking right now at a website that catalogs medieval bestiaries, and live on the podcast, I'm just looking up crab really quick. And okay, here's what you have to know about the crab, and maybe this can guide us somewhere. It is officially in the category of fish with claws. That seems right. Not usually described in bestiaries, but when it appears, it is usually as the constellation Cancer. So there's some great astrological stuff going on here. In bestiaries, it feeds on oysters, placing a stone between the shells when they open to keep them from closing. Okay, that's it. That's what we're doing. We're putting a stone between the shells of Donald Trump's presidency.
Okay. All right.
And we're going to not let it close. It's crab season.
Sure. I'm into it.
We'll get there. We'll find it.
We'll find our footing with this one, with our great 6 legs scuttling side to side. All right, Dean. So we're talking about the election. We can't not. It's like the only important political thing that's probably happened. I mean, besides business as usual horror around the world, but this is the big one that will elicit, all kinds of headlines. Everyone knows it's already happened. I'm sure everyone's already been posting about it. But Dean, do you want to give us a recap of the election? Just like what went down? What do we need to pay attention to? What are the important takes that you have to give us?
Do I want to do that? No, but maybe I'll give it a try. Yeah, the election. I mean, here's what I'll say at first. I think there are dozens of takes that are coming out of people trying to make sense of the election and trying to sort out, oh, what are the big lessons and kind of the key insights. And I think that it's good to do that kind of when the shock of it is fresh. But I also think there's kind of a cautionary moment too, to be like, it takes time to analyze all that stuff and figure out what really went on. And I think there's a place for people just like kind of making rage conclusions. I think that's fine. It kind of gets us going. But my jury is kind of out. I mean, I feel like I've read a lot of compelling takes. You know, people have pointed out lots of things that kind of resonate with me or make sense to me at a gut level. For example, when people have been doing kind of postmortems on the Harris campaign, there's been lots of talk about how the Democrats are alienated from average working people, that the election was more kind of a referendum on people looking at their grocery bills or the housing market or whatever, and kind of concluding that the election, or that the Biden administration is, you know, not doing a good job and not containing inflation. And so it's kind of a referendum on, like, I don't know, the difficulties of being an average US American person or whatever. I think that kind of makes sense to me, and also doesn't for a lot of reasons. One of the most compelling takes that I read, which is not very long, was from Walden Bello, who is a Filipino left-wing guy, interesting guy. He wrote this kind of blog post analysis where he was saying he was teaching in the US over this year, and he had predicted that Trump would win this election. And, you know, now everyone's asking him why he thought that. And he said he felt like when he would go to the grocery store and see the kind of sticker shock of prices, that was one piece. He's an economist also, by the way. He was like, you turn on the news and basically everything in the news is like the whole world's on fire, Gaza's being destroyed, and like immigrants are stealing your jobs. Like there's this kind of pandemonium, including on like left-wing cable news, or, you know, as if there is such a thing, liberal cable news channels and so on. And lastly, you know, this kind of sense that like Biden was too old and he had this disastrous debate performance. And he said the overwhelming kind of feeling he had was that, you know, the US is projecting a sort of vision where they are completely out of control of any situation domestically and foreign, which is not how US Americans like to think of themselves, right? They like to think of the US as being in control of all that stuff. And the Biden administration felt out of control. And I think there's actually some truth to that. It kind of made sense to me. I think he, in that same post, he kind of wrongly concludes that the Democrats might like take a good look in the mirror and then draw some good conclusions and kind of change from their neoliberal orthodoxy. And I think so far all signs are pointing to a complete and total active resistance of doing that and failing to learn that lesson. But I think that the analysis that he had, at least, of that kind of generalized anxiety seems right when you think of like average voters or whatever. And like I said, dozens of other insights or whatever that maybe we'll talk about more. There have been some good posts here and there, but that's the one that's sticking with me, of making sense of it. That I do think, even when I talk to Trump voters in my life, family, and so on, it's like that does seem like the vibe. Like there's a kind of disorientation, and they, of course, absurdly and wrongly feel like Trump will like get them back in control or whatever. But I think there's some truth to that, at least at like a psychoanalytic kind of level.
I think that all makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've heard a lot of the same from people in my life who decided that they wanted to be a Trump person now. It does feel like it's out of control. I mean, the ways that people express that out of control feeling are like, you know, oh, the economy is crazy and so on. And I think that's, I mean, it's not fair. I think it's bad. But I understand that as maybe a cause behind why people would vote in that particular way. I don't know, like, you know, the right-wing projection is that, well, people just think that like Trump is really cool now or something, and or that there's something appealing about him as a personality. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. I don't think that the turnout really points me in that direction, that there's like some kind of overwhelming like fascist vibe amongst the electorate. But I don't know, maybe maybe more than I'd like to believe. I don't really know. It is such a weird thing because, I mean, I'm not in the United States. I'm actually like really far from it. Both separated by space and time. The time difference is like a really killer when it comes to learning about U.S. things, honestly. But yeah, I don't know. Before the election, everyone was telling me that Kamala Harris was going to win, and it was going to be, a tough race or whatever, but she would win out in the end, and then it just, wasn't even close. Well, I suppose that's not fair to say. It was close, but not like, not as close as you would want it to be, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. The sort of out of control feeling. I paying attention to a few down ballot propositions and votes and things. Places like Missouri and Nebraska, they both voted to raise the minimum wage, which I think is pretty cool. And Missouri and a few other states as well voted to protect abortion rights in their states, which is interesting too. I don't know. All I'm trying to say is with these observations is that, like, it's not that people don't care about these things. They clearly do. And if they have an option to sort of like take the fate of their state into their hands and like change those things, they do it. So I don't know. All I'm trying to say is that it seems like people want something different, and they voted for it as a policy where they could. And some people expressed that in different ways, like voting for Donald Trump. I don't know. That's my take. It seems like people do care about something. It doesn't seem like pure nihilism or fascism or whatever. It seems like there is something going on, but it's like hard to discern exactly what to make of it all.
Yeah, I will say I'm pretty doom-pilled about it, insofar as I feel like there probably is a strong fascist undercurrent to all that. And even like voting kind of for policies, for example, that might seem more progressive or kind of affirm, I don't know, certain common goods, or like the need to raise the wage and so on. Like those kinds of things are not incompatible with fascism. And I think that is actually the troubling thing to me, is that like there's a more properly fascist sort of thing congealing in the US, where people understand, like, even the right was trying to do this over the course of the election. And I think that was the point of the Vance pick, was to do exactly that, to sort of build the tie between right-wing rhetoric on race and gender and immigration and so on, and a kind of working class sentiment, or like, which is a lie, of course, like the Republicans don't do that. But I think there is a kind of scariness to that that's true. And I think too, like, I do think, just again, psychologically, that sort of feeling of being out of control and seeing Trump as a vote for, I don't know, a strong person or whatever, like, I think that is also an underlying kind of fascist sentiment. And coupled with the fact that there is a ton of white supremacy and racism, and it's true, misogyny and everything else involved in the campaign against Harris and all that kind of stuff, like all that stuff comes together in a way that I do think is pretty frightening. But at the same time, I don't know, like it is true that there should be a lesson for the Democrats that, like, if you were to run left of the kind of platform that you have, then, it's not like you'd be alienating voters, but you might actually persuade some of them. But I also think, like, the Democrats are not a left-wing party, so they would be doing something out of their own interest as well, which is too bad, but it is what it is.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. I find it so hard to, like, really to really know exactly the motivations behind some of this. Like, whatever you mentioned that, there's probably some kind of like right-wing thing going on, like a sort of fascist undertones, and I believe that's probably true. It's just like whether or not people understand what they're doing when they're doing it is maybe another question that I wrestle with a lot. I don't know.
Totally.
But anyways, a lot of takes to have, a lot of postmortem to do and pick through, and I think but I don't know. But I think that what we said here is pretty right. Is what I'm trying to say.
Of course it is. That's why we said it.
That's right. I wouldn't say if it was wrong. But yeah, I don't know. It does seem like there's some soul searching to do for the Democrats. But yeah, like you said, they won't do it. That is definitely the case.
Yeah.
But bonkers. It's all a little too nuts, honestly.
Yeah. Thinking about this episode and what's been going on, I went back to the thing that we always go back to when we try to talk about fascism and Christianity, which is Dorothy Zoela's Christo-fascist stuff. And we repeat that so much on the podcast, so I made a conscious decision not to do that in this one. You can go listen to 800 other takes that we've had about it using Dorothy Zoela in the past. But I do think that she is, like, fundamentally right about what characterizes U.S. Christofascism as a distinct thing from her own kind of experience in Germany, where like the fascism of the U.S. is kind of made more complicated and more insidious by the fact that it doubles down on a kind of like voluntary association and a sort of individualism. So people like they choose to be fascist and kind of see that as a reflection of their values and beliefs and so on, especially when coupled with evangelicalism in a way that like Nazism was imposed more directly than the way it's kind of naturally like rooted itself in the US. And I think there's something to that really feels instructive. And it just made me think of it when you were saying the bit about figuring out the motivation or struggling to understand the motivation. For me, like that remains the most attractive kind of analysis, is that like, yeah, it's hard to identify the motivation because the motivations themselves are so fragmented. Like the motivations are all these things at once, right? Like anxiety about these social whatever, like problems, economic problems, racial relations, gender problems, whatever, the specter of transgenderism, all these kinds of things. They go into like the big pot of motivations, and the key is that like the environment is so violent and yucky and exclusionary that it's actually not hard for people to just find their own way into being like nebulously fascist. And that is the hard part, because it's like Nazism as a kind of collectivism is maybe in some ways like obviously really hard to defeat. Like you have to like go to war with them or whatever, or they did, but that's what they did, right? You could like point to that and be like, that's like the collective thing that we don't want. Whereas the kind of distributed fascism of Christofascism in the US is harder to identify, harder to parse out, and people don't even see themselves as like signing on to that ideology. I mean, in some cases it's more explicit, like the kind of Christian nationalist, like whatever, but that is not, like when I think about people in my rural hometown who voted for Donald Trump, like they don't know anything about that and couldn't care less. They've just chosen for their own reasons to kind of, sign up to this sort of program that isn't that programmed, which is quite difficult to parse out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, big time. Well, I feel like we could have a devolved conversation more about that, but you said, let's not even talk about North Venezuela. So we're not going to. Dean, I'm wondering. Okay, I mean the Donald Trump thing. It's concerning. We don't like it. To me, like my brain immediately went to like, what are the ripple effects of this actually going to be? This is just like maybe my reflection on the early days of the Trump presidency, or that like that transitionary period in 2016 or whatever. But it seemed like the vibe was that the Trump's transition team it wasn't very serious, in the sense that like they were kind of pulling together a group of people who were not sort of political insiders and that didn't really know that much about politics. Mm-hmm. Especially like when he's like sticking family members and friends and sort of like, and then also turning to like Republican establishment types of people, like Mike Pence or Rance Priebus or whatever. Like that's just sort of like to me seems like a weird rookie mistake, like in 2016, to be like, you won the most powerful seat at the table, and you're going to ask a bunch of people who already have a seat at the table like what to do. Like you're supposed to be a political outsider. You're not really doing any of that. But this time it does seem a bit different, because Trump has surrounded himself with a lot of extremely bad people, I would say. And anyway, so that's where my brain went to this time. Like, is it going to be sort of like a bumbling cohort of big dinguses, or is it going to be like right wing, like terrorist squad people? Like, will Tom Cotton be a part of this, and how? And mm-hmm. is my question. And yes, it seems like. But I was also wondering too, like, what does a Donald Trump presidency mean for like the poly crisis of climate change in 2024? A big concern. Especially, I don't know, like COP is coming up in Azerbaijan, and there's going to be all kinds of talk about the climate and like where we're at in the world with regard to global average temperatures and stuff. And now, so anyways, I just like started taking a look around, and the Financial Times, which is the business press, the capitalist press, it's going to tell you all about capitalism and what's happening. They did some reporting on who Donald Trump is going to pick to be his new, quote, energy czar, which is terrifying. So the Biden administration has a climate czar, and this is sort of like the replacement role. And the pick that I guess Trump is like leaning towards is the guy from North Dakota, Doug Burgum, who is like a billionaire sort of like oil lobbyist kind of guy, which is not great at all. And I hate that, right? Like that's bad. Don't put an oil guy in charge of like climate related stuff, because you know what they're gonna do. I mean, they're obviously already beholden to it. But then I read this other piece that I thought was even more terrifying than that. So I'll read it here from the Financial Times, breaking down the paywall, giving people a free peek into what's happening on this weird magazine. So anyways, in the Financial Times, it says the president-elect has vowed to gut at least 10 regulations across the federal government for every new one created, and said that he would appoint Tesla chief executive Elon Musk to helm a new efficiency commission, quote, tasked with conducting a complete financial and performance audit of the entire federal government, making recommendations for drastic reforms. And then it says rules governing climate and energy are set to bear the brunt of the regulatory bonfire. I guess this was like, I was in crab season. I was crabbing out. I was pinching. I was hissing, whatever it is that crabs do, blowing bubbles. I don't know. And then I read this part and I was like, oh no, this is the most terrifying thing ever. Not only is like it makes sense, right? Okay, of course a right wing guy is going to put an oil guy in charge of energy in the United States. That makes sense to me. And like, that changes what climate activism might look like in the United States. But then also to say that Elon Musk is sort of like in charge of government efficiency or whatever is just like it's the Fonz jumping the shark on Happy Days. It is like it's just like the weirdest thing to happen. So anyways, none of that's set in stone. Maybe it'll be different. Maybe it won't be as bad. Maybe it will be worse. It's hard to say, but I'm clip clapping my claws over here. I don't like it. I'm extremely crabby. It's so frustrating to see all of it, and also, I mean, it's not like Kamala Harris is making like some great degrowth communist suggestions or whatever about the environment, but things would have certainly looked different and maybe wouldn't have been quite as dire. I don't know. Is there anything that is really knocking you over the head about this whole thing?
I mean, so many things. Like because of my day job and interests, I guess I am always thinking about international solidarity and international relations, and it is pretty terrifying for the poorest people in the entire world what this kind of regime will be. The economic policies that Trump is putting forward seem pretty damaging for a lot of international economic relationships. I think there's also a lot of the climate change piece is clear. There's a lot of concern about like it's already hard enough to get anything done at a place like COP or other kind of multilateral fora, and like now it'll be impossible, I guess, to do that, which is crazy. I think when you get to things like Gaza and all that kind of stuff, like obviously the Biden administration was doing a very bad job and had no intention of ending that genocide, and I don't think that it would have like made it better to have Biden or to have Harris take over that file, that horrible event. But I think the kind of Trump worldview about America's role in the world and what he means when he says he wants to make peace in the Middle East and all that kind of stuff means basically like a rapid intensification of violence and more regional destabilization and a kind of desire to ally with international rightists who are currently trying to remake the global order in their own image, which is obviously really frightening given developments in the EU and everywhere else. I feel like the Trump election kind of just reduces the space to do anything international in what was already an incredibly small and crowded space. So that freaks me out. And I mean, there's all the other stuff too. Like, I'm nervous for what his kind of administration will do about trans rights. I'm nervous about what it will do about, racial politics and so on. I think all that stuff is really concerning. The mass deportation stuff is probably the most terrifying to me right now. And like, you know, he's already working with like private prison companies to essentially build what will inevitably be concentration camps for immigrants to be sent to. Some of whom might get deported out of them. Many of them will probably just languish there and be abused or killed or whatever. And like, I think the craziest thing is that those kinds of like awful projections of what will happen in those places are not without precedent in Trump's first term, right? Like that's how he treated that issue already, and he'll do it even worse this time around. It's like, I think that is what's troubling to me. And the worst part of it is like, it's not as though what Trump is doing and promising to do is a sort of radical break from what has been done in the last 4 years. And that also terrifies me. Like, so many policies that Trump put in place during his first administration were just simply like repeatedly rubber stamped by Biden over and over and over again, including immigration brutality and, you know, policies toward Cuba and all these other things. And none of that stuff was undone. And it's not going to be undone because Biden apparently believes in it, which is crazy. And all that stuff now that Biden had kind of made sure to maintain those items, they will just get ratcheted up in the next 4 years. So, you know, I think to me, like, that is also a kind of last frightening note, is that like Trump keeps pushing the Democrats to the right. Everybody knows that. But the Democrats keep like, instead of like pushing him back, they keep sort of holding the line, you know, just like suspending the right wing victories until the right can get in and then continue to like careen off the cliff into some awful direction. So yeah, all that stuff freaks me out.
Yeah, it is very scary. It is such a weird thing though, that the rubber stamping of the Biden administration of Trump policies, I think, is so silly, silly and sad and like pathetic all at the same time. I mean, Cuba is a great example where, you know, we've talked about it before, but there's like sort of this Obama thaw, and that's great. And then Trump is in office, and it's a hard right wing turn, and you know, the continued persecution of the Cuban people and the Cuban state, and that's all very bad. And then Biden comes into power, and he just says like, okay, we're going to just keep doing this, you know, like, and now 4 years later, like, what does he have to show for it? But like nothing. He was brutal and awful to Cuba, and like created more of a crisis in Cuba, and he has like nothing to show for it, I guess, which is to say, like, even if Biden would have won or something and he still had done that, it wouldn't have been worth it. But like, it's such a pathetic thing that he backtracked on his previous policy that he did himself hold during the Obama presidency about Cuba, and then he just gets nowhere with it. It's just so sad. It's so sad and so pathetic. It's like a really weak-willed party with no sort of vision or sense of justice, just sort of letting the old policies of the Trump administration fly, and then, you know, the whole thing shifts to the right and so on, like you were saying. Just really sad and stupid.
And as you said, like, for what, right? Like the ostensible reason for Democrats holding that incredibly brutal policy toward Cuba is that they don't want to lose voters in Florida, or what stupidest term that they use of being the, quote, Latino vote, as though that's like one single and obvious block that doesn't have a variety of political opinions within it. An incredibly racist idea, by the way, that liberals have. So the ostensible reason to do that didn't materialize, right? Like, Florida is overwhelmingly Republican, and it will be forever, for a while at least, in the foreseeable future. And like that, if that is the raison d'etre for punishing an entire country, is that you desperately hope that you win a swing state that you know that you won't, like, that's pretty brutal. And as you said, it wouldn't have justified it even if they did win. Like, there's no justification for it. But the fact that they don't even get the kind of thing that they think that they're doing when they're playing like 4-dimensional chess with human lives and so on is so frustrating, endlessly frustrating.
Okay, it's frustrating. But now that we've talked about how frustrating it is, let's talk about something else frustrating. In light of the Trump victory, people in the United States are saying what people are saying everywhere in the world in the face of right-wing regimes rising to power. This sucks, it's bad, but you got to organize. You know, you can't let the election be the last word, and now you got to take it to them in this sort of other way outside of electoral politics in terms of, you know, social movements and stuff like that. Dean, have you seen a lot of this content where people are are pushing this idea of organization or something. Is that in your algorithm?
I've seen it, and I've even made it.
Yeah, me too. And I think that that is correct. That the messaging that you should now get involved in anti-fascist organizing in a lot of different capacities. I think that's right. I think you should do that. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical sometimes. Like we do on this podcast. I myself can be accused of this, and I think fair enough when I am. That sometimes we say things like, "Well, you need to organize against that," and it's sort of vague, and we're not being specific because I don't know on a podcast how specific can we be telling you to organize something or something else? I don't know. It's a sort of a part of like a limitation of the platform, and we don't know your particular situations and so on. You should organize, that's true, but like what does organizing mean, or like where should you be doing it is a thing that I've seen people talking a lot about. And I think that there's some provisions that maybe we can stick in here as people who are involved in some organizing efforts ourselves, and maybe just like a gentle nudge in a direction. I saw this Twitter graphic. It was more like I guess it was more of like a square Instagram graphic that somebody had reposted to Twitter. It's fine, whatever, no big deal. And someone and the tiles were like, people are telling me to organize. What does that mean? What does that look like? What does it look like to organize? And then the suggestions were things like, join a radical reading club, make radical art with your friends, make radical zines together, do radical theater. And like, that's just fine. Like do all of that for sure. Get together with your pals and knit a big anti-fascist flag to have at your next march. Like, there's nothing wrong with any of that. I guess the thing that I would like to add though is that those things are good and great, and you should do them. But dang, if you want to organize, you have to find like the levers of power that you need to pull to get people to listen to you. And while theater and zines and art can be a part of that, you probably need to figure out how to organize so that you can be a roadblock to the status quo of capital, by which I mean organizing your workplace and making it so that you can go on strike and you have more of a democratic decision-making model over like what you do at work and how all that works and how you get paid and different policies and so on. So all I'm trying to say here is all the people who are yelling at you to organize, like absolutely do all of that stuff. A mutual aid fundraiser is awesome and good. But I think, finding those real levers of power in the world are actually a lot more difficult. And, those are all great places to start. But maybe the next step is something even more than those.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, it is complicated to have the organizing conversation. And like, naturally, as a person who's learned a lot from Karl Marx, I think that organizing workers in particular is unique for also lots of reasons we've talked about in the past on the show, and we'll probably talk about in the future. But two things I've been thinking about a lot lately. There was that interview with the guy from the Painters Union that Jacobin had posted, which is really good. I forget the title of it, but he made a very good point. Several good points, but he was saying, organized labor did its job in this election. Like, if you were a unionized labor person, you were more likely to vote for Harris than many other demographics across the spectrum. And he said, we showed up, unions did what they're supposed to do. But the thing is, unions are the ones who were talking to their members. The Democratic Party was not talking to their members. And that's an important disconnect. And he also made the observation, like we've talked about again on the show elsewhere, that union density in the US is like negligibly small. Like, it is so small. Yeah. And I think like absolutely 100% organize your workplace and like do that understanding that like every part of the deck is stacked against you in doing that. And I think that it's like a real challenge for people on the left to sort that out. Like, everybody ought to try to think about how to organize their workplace for sure, and make inroads and contact a union and figure out how to do that 100%. But like, that is the long game, definitely, right? Like, union density is not going to change in the next 4 years such that people could have a general strike, whatever that means, and like, bring the government to its knees, which, yes, like that is what should happen. That would be great in like the fantasies we all have about how we figure it out. That's what happens, but that's not going to happen in the next 4 years. And I think that it raises lots of other questions about organizing, like what are the spaces that are productive, where to do it. And I think, like you said, Matt, it's impossible to give like a general kind of piece of advice on a podcast about that. And I think that side note, you should distrust any kind of general podcast or YouTube channel or whatever that like is trying to tell you what to do. I think that is bad. And apart from the general advice of organizing, but the thing that at least I often say, even in my own context, is like, you should just look around and figure out what people are doing and just like go do that. Like, even if it's not even getting somewhere super far, I think even learning how to organize with others and like failing at it, like I've failed to organize dozens of things, and I think that is important. Like, you learn a lot from all that stuff, and I do think that it's kind of like organized everywhere and anywhere. You know, like if people in your region seem to be like really passionate and effective at organizing against, I don't know, like people getting arrested, like go out to that stuff. If they're like organizing to stop people from being deported, go to that stuff. Like whatever is happening, you know, it's good to just learn it and figure that out. But yeah, all that to say, like, I completely agree. Organize your workplace. That is the ultimate key to sorting it out. But in between, there's lots of vectors.
Totally. That's all good advice. And as a podcast who's telling you how to organize, you shouldn't listen to any of it. But
That's right.
No, exactly like what you're saying, though. I mean, like 10% is what union density is in the United States. That's not enough to make a dent. You know, it's enough to have power for sure. Like, don't get me wrong. It's not nothing, but it is not. It's not what's going to get you the big general strike that stops any of this from happening. I would also point out too, organizing a union in your workplace is hard. It's an uphill battle, and to be completely transparent, you're not supposed to win. Like, is the thing. You're not supposed to be able to win. It is like rigged against you 100%. And in fact, like without a lot of push and pull and careful strategizing, you'll probably lose. Is like depressing and disappointing, but also true. But something I've learned a lot working with fast food workers is that winning a union is also not the end all and be all of having, you know, doing workplace organizing. You do have a lot of rights as workers, even if you don't have a union. You can do unfair labor practice strikes. Like you have the right as a worker to go on strike, kind of if there's an unfair labor practice going on, and that's dangerous to do, by the way, without a union. I want to say as well, to be completely responsible about what I'm saying. It's hard, it's scary, bad, and difficult. But I don't know. That's all there is to do, is to do those things. So I don't know what else to say about it.
All right, we're getting to the end here. I feel like maybe we'll go a few minutes over, but I'm okay with that if you are, Matt. I'm doing a quick vibe check. Are you okay to go over 10 minutes on this podcast?
Yeah.
Great. In that case, there are two other things I thought would be good to talk through. One is returning to Evangelicals for Harris. This doesn't have to take a long part of our podcast, but
okay.
I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been thinking about it too much, and I did make the confession that I had been looking at John Pavlovich's Twitter a few episodes ago, and that I needed to stop. And I do want to say in this podcast, I'm proud of myself for having stopped, but like the Bible says, as a dog returns to his vomit, so have I returned to John Pavlovich's Twitter feed. And he has gone full Blue Anon, which is a wild pivot, but not unpredictable. So I think that is an interesting development, that there's a kind of like liberal Christian influencer that as a result of this election has been completely co-opted into like the kind of blue wave brainworm Trump resistance, and that will be an annoying trend over the next 4 years. But the good news is you don't have to worry about that because they don't matter. The one thing I think is interesting, though, is the Evangelicals for Harris thing that had emerged, which, as far as I can tell, is basically a Twitter account and people who occasionally go to the media and tell people that they're evangelicals who care about the Democrats. They had sort of committed to staying together, I guess. When I say committed to, I mean they made a tweet about how they're not going away. An ominous tweet for all of us. And I think what's really fascinating to me is it's been making the rounds, but this election saw a massive, again, wave of evangelical support for Donald Trump. About 8 in 10 white evangelical Christian voters, according to some polls, in other places more or less, voted for Trump. And that level of support essentially mirrors, I mean, maybe there's a little bit of attrition from evangelicals, but really, let's face it, really not. from the 2016 election, and I think that is such a like important indictment that evangelicals did not learn their lesson over the last Trump presidency or over the Biden presidency, that they continue to remain a faithful block in the Christo-fascist building of, you know, whatever edifice of disaster they're about to build. And I feel like it is still essential to kind of keep resisting that like, you know, whatever. So there are good evangelicals out there. I know some of them even listen to this podcast. And as we've talked also on the show before, there are dissident traditions of evangelicalism, especially in Latin America, kind of liberation theology versions of it. And I think that is very cool. But the idea that, like, you know, evangelicals are going to somehow be kind of organized against the bulk of that tradition is pretty far-fetched. And not just to pick on them. I think, like, Christians all across the board basically failed. Like, Catholics overwhelmingly voted for Trump as well, though not with the same intensity as evangelicals. So not to say that everybody else doesn't, you know, they're the only ones who don't have their house in order or something. But I think, like, you do see even a similar problem with the kind of, like, Catholic Democrats and Twitter accounts and, like, all these people who are trying to, like, mobilize their particular Christian constituency for, like, the most boring version of the Democratic Party. I think that strategy has been proven to be completely false and busted. And I think if Christians want to oppose all that stuff, they also have to oppose that sort of attempt to carry in a Christian reconciliation with, like, the Democratic establishment, which is inevitably going to be a major push in the next, you know, 6 months at least, and probably over the next 4 years. So all that to say, as always, it's time to rediscover all that liberation theology stuff. And, you know, I think we have to spend the next 4 years also telling the liberals that it's not enough to just hitch your wagon to the Democrats and hope that they deliver you and kind of give you a pat on the back at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to say. Something, man, I was thinking, you know, we've spent so much time dunking on evangelicals for Harris and being annoyed at them. And, you know, whatever. That's our prerogative. We can do that, I guess. In the exit polls from this past election, though, it did say that, like, you know, the 63% of people who voted for Trump said that they were Protestant or other Christian, whereas 36% said that they were 36% of people who voted for Democrat said that they were Protestant. And all I'm trying to say here is with these numbers is, I don't know, there's all kinds of, like, you know, suspicious things about this. But, like, 36% of Protestant or evangelical, such a small number to begin with for evangelicals for Harris. And then the actual evangelical voting block in the exit polls was so much smaller. Like, 80% voted for Trump and 17% voted for the Democrats. So it's like the evangelicals for Harris is trying to target such a small group of people to begin with. It's like, what is your point even, you know, from the start? It's such a weird, such a weird niche that you're trying to hit. Like, 17%, that's nothing. Like, what are you doing? I mean, there's all kinds of complications with that, exactly because of turnout and, you know, the crazy identification of religious tradition and all of it. But it's just such a weird thing, a weird aberration.
Yeah.
Please do not come back.
It really is. And speaking about liberation theology, I thought maybe we could close this episode by following that very advice, because our favorite liberation theologians are busy writing about all this kind of stuff. Leonardo Boff, Fry Beto, all the rest of them, they're tweeting, they're writing articles, etc. And there was a really good one published actually right before the election by Fry Beto. And Boff actually reposted it on his blog, so you know it's great. It's really making the rounds down there in Brazil, and I think it deserves to make the rounds up here as well in the north. You can read it, just use Google Translate or whatever on Leonardo Boff's blog. That's what I do, and it works just fine. When I was saying just a moment ago that, like, the kind of strategy of hitching your wagon to the Democrats is a failing one, I was kind of having in mind the analysis that Beto is making here, and I thought I'd bring that up to sort of maybe close on a wider vision. So I'm going to read a little bit of this, and then maybe we can talk it through. But Matt, you can just interrupt me and tell me to stop if you want to talk about one part or another. So Beto, he's kind of like looking around and analyzing what's going on. And by the way, if you don't know who Fray Beto is, he's a Brazilian Dominican priest who's a liberation theologian. He interviewed Fidel Castro in a famous book called Fidel and Religion, but he also himself resisted the dictatorship in Brazil, was imprisoned for it. Just an incredible person. So anyway, a person of the left who knows what he's talking about. So he said this. he talks about how, first of all, like his generation is the generation that came out of all these big social struggles, like against Brazil, like the Cuban Revolution, a kind of situation where there was like a real possibility and a sort of set of hopes for what the future could be. And now he says there's obviously been a major shift away from that kind of thing. And so in the article, he's trying to kind of diagnose that. So he says, for example, my generation was nourished by Marxism and had as real references the socialist countries that, despite everything, represented a civilizational advance compared to capitalist countries, especially in terms of reducing social inequalities. All this has collapsed. Pressured by the blockade imposed by the US, Cuba is facing a serious economic crisis, and China is sustained by the paradox of adopting a socialist policy and a capitalist economy. And this is kind of the kicker. He says, without paradigms, utopias cannot be fostered. And without utopias, there's no hope. The socialist horizon has been erased from the political scene of the left. Left-wing leaders are even afraid to say the word socialism, which is stigmatized by the right. They're afraid of burning their mouths. They know that socialism sounds like a synonym for communism and doesn't attract votes. There's no longer any prospect of a post-capitalist alternative. The aim is to mitigate the abuses of the system and expand networks of social benefits to the poorest, without, however, combating the structural causes of inequality and environmental imbalances. He goes on to say a lot more, and he kind of adds that this is one big reason that the right is coming back, that they're sort of like providing a bit of a paradigm. I'll pause there before going to the end because he has some other great insights to say. But I thought that was actually a really important note, that like the left doesn't really have a paradigm at this stage, which is to say it doesn't have a sort of unifying vision or a horizon of where it wants to go. And the best it sees it doing is kind of stemming the bleeding, or like, you know, treating symptoms rather than the disease, not dealing with these structural issues. And if you don't have a kind of bigger paradigm, you can't have a utopic vision. You can't have a vision of the future that you're moving toward aspirationally. It's all kind of reactive to whatever the right is doing. And that's very dangerous. And I thought it was interesting that this also kind of echoed an analysis in Dissent that we've been talking about in the Discord a little bit by Gabrielle Wanat, which is kind of arguing something similar, that the Democrats have lost any sense of like a cohesive vision for what a better world could look like. And because they don't have the courage to put that forward, you know, the kind of jumble of bad policies and austerity politics and so on is not enough to attract an electorate, which I think is obvious from the turnout of the election. So just to say, I think that Beto sort of surveying the situation, that seems right to me, and seems like the kind of thing that if you're an Evangelicals for Harris person or like a Catholic Democrats person, you're sort of actively shutting yourself off from like thinking beyond what's going on in those campaigns.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, actually. That's a good idea, a good point. A few of us on the Discord have been reading the new Andreas Malm book called Overshoot, and there's actually a sort of an idea similar to this that comes up in it, where Malm starts talking about this idea about how there's an anti-revolution, where there's like sort of a negation of there's negation of and like reaction to what could be revolutionary perspectives on climate change, and how big of a problem it is that, you know, no one on the left is sort of building a platform that is out there to say, you know, we need a war communism for climate change or something. You know, there's no radical left perspective, vision, or like demand even from capital. It's just sort of like everyone's being strung along by what seems politically achievable, or even what is not politically achievable, but like, you know, is sort of still like within the liberal framework or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I think this is a really good point, that there is just sort of this, there's not a touchstone, there's not a perspective, there's not a paradigm for something more radical than what we have on the left at this point in the United States. You know, there are organizations, there are groups. I think that there are people who could enunciate like what it would mean to do this, but it's not like as available as it would need to be to the entire population.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and it's a good segue into the end of this article, where Beto has a few lines that might sound kind of like an old man berating young people, but as a like maybe not quite a young person anymore, but younger than some, I have to admit, I think he's right. He says this: today, the number of young people suffocated by nihilism is immeasurable. They ignore ethics, are indifferent to religion, despise politics, and have ideas as misaligned as the strands of their hair. The dream only of having a good job and a comfortable life, a place in the sun, in this increasingly narrow and exclusionary system. This situation forces progressive forces to take a step back and reevaluate their political actions, their language, their programs, and their objectives. And then he says the world's going backwards from utopia to dystopia. And I think you could read that as like, I don't know, in a kind of resentful way or frustrated way, being like, well, young people are doing their part. But one of the big stories coming out of the 2024 election is that, you know, like Gen Z didn't do their part when it comes to voting for Harris. And also, like, when I say do their part, I don't mean like, oh, everybody has to show up for Kamala Harris. Like a pretty wild expectation that like she's just kind of automatically granted that support. And on the contrary, there was a spike in kind of younger people voting for Donald Trump. And I think that it's a real crisis, especially for people of my generation, our generation, millennials, who are kind of like a weird transitional generation, maybe between certain people. I hate that kind of generational politics stuff, but I think that there is something to it when it comes to like, I don't know, our peers drive me insane, I think in part because there is a sense of this, like the best of us, you know, whatever, people, they got energized by Bernie Sanders and they still go out to stuff. And I don't mean to like shit on everybody who is under 40, but like, I do think that there's something about what Beto's saying that's true, that there's this kind of hope to get a good job, a comfortable life, a place in the sun in a narrow and exclusionary system. Like when I go to rallies and protests, it's not true that there are like multitudes of young people going to those things, you know, like that's an indictment in and of itself. And I think Beto's point here is not to like blame the generations for being young and stupid. And I think that's actually the biggest piece of his take. It's to say there's something that the left is doing wrong, where younger people do not see themselves as part of a kind of paradigm building moment in the way that they would have in like the 1960s and 70s and 80s, which were mostly youth movements, like the Cuban Revolution, a youth movement, the Black Panther Party, a youth movement. You know, the average age of like a person in the Young Lords is something like 17 to like 19 or something like that. Like these are movements where young people felt like there was something possible that they could do. And I think there are lots of good reasons that young people don't feel that way now. And I don't think it's as simple as like, oh, our generation is just not hopeful. I think it is worse. The situation's worse. But the left is not giving, you know, compelling kind of reasons or even structures or kind of organizational capacity to young people to feel like it would be possible to do something different. And if that's the case, then what else could you do, I guess, you know, if you're not like a person poisoned by reading books or like, you know, haven't kind of magically found your way into a left-wing space, what else could you do other than like try to get a good life in an increasingly exclusionary system? You know, that's the best that you feel you can probably get. So all that to say, I think Beto's point is actually really instructive, that the left needs to figure out how to build something that is compelling for people to be part of. And I don't think, by the way, that it looks like what a lot of liberal commentators are saying now, where you kind of have to like become the anti-woke liberal that Sohrab Ahmari wants you to be or something like that, right? It requires like building a kind of network of solidarity that can link struggles together, which has always been the challenge of the left, and one where when the left meets that challenge, it is able to achieve really ambitious goals. But we currently aren't able to do that. I think that's a huge indictment and something that we'll have to think about for the next 4 years and beyond.
Yeah, that seems like a big problem. The left, it's not giving utopia, it's not giving progress, it's not giving another world as possible. It's just giving, I don't know, old grandpas, uphill battles, impossible fights. A big problem.
A big problem. The last thing that I'll just say about these big problems is the other person I was reading this week is Francine Clemert, the liberation theologian who passed away not too long ago. And he also had something to say about utopias, which is interesting. Kind of an inverted piece of analysis from Beto, but they go together. You know, Beto's saying that we've moved from utopia to dystopia. Hank Lemire has a pretty famous line where he says, it's not the case that we live in a dystopia. Rather, it's the case that we live in the utopia of capitalism. That, like, this is the world that capitalism has always wanted to build, is trying to build. And we live in the utopia of Donald Trump, right? Like, he's living his best life right now. And we're all living in that utopia. And I think that the kind of play between, like, how do we get the utopia that we actually want, and also recognize that we are living in somebody else's utopia is something that's kind of keeping me up when I'm not thinking of what element one of the gospels would be.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do support us, we're so thankful. Thank you so much. It's really nice of you to do. And if you do that, you get an invite to our Discord channel full of young people who are ready to see what revolutionary politics look like. And you can be one of them if you just support us on Patreon. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon. And we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater,